React Native allows developers to reuse components from one user interface on multiple platforms. React Native was introduced by Facebook to reduce the pain of teams who were rewriting their user interfaces for web, iOS, and Android. Nader Dabit hosts React Native Radio, a podcast about React Native. Nader also trains companies to use React Native through his company React Native Training. In this episode, we explore what a developer can and cannot do with React Native and the state of the ecosystem, when a developer needs to use native APIs instead of React Native, and some speculation on the future of React Native. This episode is a good preface for tomorrow's episode about React Native interfaces with Leland Richardson of Airbnb. In that episode, we're going to dive deeper into how React Native works and just how big of a change it could be for cross-platform developers. If you are looking for some specific episodes about different topics in software engineering, check out our new topic feeds. We have these new feeds in iTunes or wherever you find your podcasts. We've sorted all 500 of our old episodes into categories like business and blockchain, and JavaScript and machine learning. We have a greatest hits category that I recommend. It's the best episodes of software engineering. If you haven't been with the show since the beginning, you may find these feeds useful for figuring out which old episodes to listen to, because there's a lot of evergreen content in Software Engineering Daily. So whatever specific area of software you're curious about, we have a feed for you, and you can check the show notes for more details. To build the kinds of things developers want to build today, they need better tools, super tools, like a database that'll grow as your business grows and is easy to manage. That's why Amazon Web Services built Amazon Aurora, a relational database engine that's compatible with MySQL or PostgreSQL, and provides up to 5 times the performance of standard MySQL on the same hardware. Amazon Aurora from AWS can scale up to millions of transactions per minute, automatically grow your storage up to 64 terabytes if need be, and replicate 6 copies of your data to 3 different availability zones. Amazon Aurora tolerates failures and even automatically fixes them and continually backs up your data to Amazon S3. And Amazon RDS fully manages it all, so you don't have to. If you're already using Amazon RDS for MySQL, you can migrate to Amazon Aurora with just a few clicks. So what you're getting here is up to 5 times better performance than MySQL with the security, availability, and reliability of a commercial database, all at 1/10 of the cost. No upfront charges, no commitments, and you only pay for what you use. Check out aurora.aws and start imagining what you can build with Amazon Aurora from AWS. That's aurora.aws, aurora.aws. Nader Dabit is the host of React Native Radio. Nader, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thank you for having me.
You're the host of React Native Radio, which is a podcast about React Native, and you run a company called React Native Training. So you have your ear to the ground on how people are using React Native. And the most recent show that we did about React Native was about Expo. We talked about the future of React Native, and we can touch on that a bit today, but from you, I'd really like to understand the present of React Native. What are the types of projects that developers are building with React Native today?
Well, there is really a huge range of things that people are building. First of all, our company, React Native Training, we do a lot of on-site consulting and, of course, training for large software companies, Fortune 500 companies. But we also work with startups. And it's just been very interesting to see the type of companies that are picking React Native up. Companies that you would think of as not really needing to worry about what a lot of people use React Native for. And that is for maybe cost savings, or maybe they want to develop across an array of platforms and they're a startup. So they're kind of limited on developers. So then React Native is maybe seen of maybe as like a cost cutting measure in some areas, or by some people, I guess I would say. But we're actually seeing companies that have no worries about money, no worries about anything. They're taking React Native on and they're using it, and they're actually using it for many of their newer projects. So if they have a lot of brownfield projects, they may stick to native, but a lot of their newer projects, they're actually implementing React Native. In general, I would say anything that's not really related to gaming. So pretty much anything across the board. But I would say one thing I've seen people kind of, not use React Native for is anything that needs a lot of animations as far as like, what you would think of, I guess, with games and stuff like that. As far as any type of business applications, social applications, pretty much anything people are using React Native for.
When you talk about these games, these high performance, heavy animation, heavy visual applications, what are the limitations of React Native that prevent people from writing like a game, like a really rich experience?
Well, there just isn't a ton of like platforms that are kind of built on top of React Native for gaming. For example, if you want to build a game, Unity is just such a robust and mature platform. And from Unity you can basically export to iOS and Android. So it's kind of like there's just a lot more tooling there, and it would just be quite a bit of work. Now there have been a few games that have been built with React Native, but nothing kind of like too crazy, I guess I would say.
What are some examples? So let's say I'm just writing an application like a Netflix or a Facebook on React Native, where are the places where I have to write native code, where I'm going to have to duck down beneath the React Native layer into the actual native code? What are the different areas of the iOS stack or the Android stack that are not yet accessible via React Native?
I would say as of now, most of everything that you need for pretty much 95% of the use cases is already there in React Native as part of the framework. I would say about a year ago, we were going into the native code and kind of exposing APIs and things like that much more than we are today. But really, it would be more like a very specific use case in your company, say that you need a certain API that isn't exposed, that is kind of a one-off type of thing, I would say. But most of the things that you're going to need are actually already available. And I see more and more as we go on, the need to actually dig into the native side is just kind of going away.
So if I'm just writing an iOS app these days, or if I'm just writing an Android app these days, how does the experience of React Native compare to the native experience? Should I just be writing all of my iOS apps in React Native?
Well, I would say, and this is a question that comes up quite a bit, especially when we do this on-site training and on-site consulting. We're working mainly these days with native developers because a lot of the people that are coming into React Native or that are seeing the most benefit out of it are companies that have iOS teams and Android teams, and these teams are working great on their own, but when they are trying to create maybe a cross-platform experience that kind of mimics the entire UI, both on iOS and Android, they're having issues. So I would say if you're building an app that only needs to run on iOS or an app that only needs to run on Android, I would stick with the platform, the native platform. But if you do need to build cross-platform, use React Native. And the benefit, I guess, mainly that we're seeing and what mainly the native developers are really liking about React Native, for the most part, is going to be kind of like the hot module replacement and the live reloading and the developer experience as far as being able to build and iterate and see results quickly without having to wait for that long compile time. So a lot of these developers are used to having to wait anywhere between 15 seconds to maybe even a couple of minutes for their app to compile. But with React Native, it's kind of instant and they're able to work faster, iterate faster, build components that are kind of, instead of like working in their own language as far as like what they're used to doing as an iOS developer, maybe working with Objective-C or Swift and Android, Java or whatever. Now they're kind of being placed on teams where they're working on a component or a feature, and they implement that feature, and that's kind of their thing, as opposed to implementing a feature in a language. They're implementing a feature across the entire app.
What's the relationship between Apple and the React Native community?
I wouldn't say there's that much of a relationship. They've made it pretty clear about a few things that are React Native specific, like the idea of hot updating your app by bypassing the App Store, and they've kind of made it clear that that's okay as long as we're only using JavaScript. The relationship between Apple and React Native, I would say Apple is one of the few companies that I've seen that have not kind of publicly adopted React Native and used it within their company, at least that I know of. I know they're using a little bit of React, but I'm not sure if they've actually done any React Native stuff.
Do you get a sense that there's a disdain from Apple, or are they just you just get the sense that they're just like ignore it, they don't care, they're living in their own Apple world?
Well, I mean, looking at it from a business perspective, it seems like they would want to have more high quality apps come into the App Store so they can make more money. So if React Native kind of allows that, it seems like it would be good for them in the long run.
Mm-hmm. What about Google? Google's got Android. What's their perspective on React Native?
So Google, they have, of course, Angular, and Angular has something similar to React Native called NativeScript. So they seem to kind of be focusing on that Angular side. I haven't really seen a lot of movement as far as React Native with Google, at least that I know of. I know they've developed this new framework they're kind of talking about, and it should be kind of getting a little more momentum called Flutter, I believe it's called. And Flutter kind of allows you to do something similar to React Native, but it's using Dart. So that's going to be interesting to watch. I don't know enough about it to really speak of it, but it's something to kind of take a look into it if you're, I guess, interested in this sort of stuff.
Well, it's so interesting to watch, the difference in how certain open source technologies are perceived. Like you look at Kubernetes, for example, and part of the open source community probably would love for Amazon to adopt Kubernetes wholeheartedly, but because there is a certain threat, or at least a perceived threat to their business, Amazon, the threat to AWS by Google Cloud having really good knowledge of how to run Kubernetes, there is not, at least as far as I can tell, much public adoption of Kubernetes from AWS's side. It seems to be the same thing with React Native. You have this highly popular way of writing mobile apps, and yet maybe the less popular ways of doing cross-platform mobile apps, or Google coming out with just brand new ways to write cross-platform mobile apps. I don't know. In a perfect world, it seemed for the consumer, it would seem like there would be more adoption for React Native, but unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world.
Yeah, I mean, and Dart has been something that they've kind of been trying to push for a while now. If you remember a few years ago, they made a few big launches and they were kind of pushing Dart, and it just hasn't seemed to be picked up. And I'm kind of prone to kind of talk about React Native in the sense that the reason that it's become so widely adopted and it's become so successful is that it just uses JavaScript. It is a great engineering feat and it's amazing to work with and it's great. But I believe that it's gotten to be that because there's been so many developers that have been able to kind of use it, contribute back to it, give feedback about it, because there's just so many JavaScript developers. The problem is there are just not a lot of Dart developers. There's not a lot of developers in some of these other languages that other things are coming out in, like say C# for Xamarin. Xamarin's great, but there's just not the number of C# developers as there are JavaScript developers. So I would kind of contribute part of React Native's success to the fact that a lot of these traditionally web developers are coming into it, contributing to it, being able to pick it up and write apps with it. Then you also have the native developers that are kind of using it. So it's kind of like that critical mass, and I would kind of attribute much of their success of React Native to that.
When Apple comes out with something like ARKit, which is this framework for augmented reality recently, how does that kind of announcement affect the React Native community, or does it affect the React Native community at all?
I'm kind of curious to learn more about ARKit. Do you have any information about it? Like what language it's built in and all of that?
No, all I've seen is the splash page.
I would say, we're always most developers are always kind of like tuned into what's going on in the world of software development. So I think that kind of lends itself to a few different things. One is, what is the next platform? Right now, the big platform that is kind of dominating is mobile, but that's not always going to be the case probably. There's going to be something else that kind of comes out. So for me, at least, I'm not sure I can speak to the rest of the community, but I'm always kind of interested in what's going to be kind of the next platform. And I think we're years away from kind of really knowing and seeing that. There's AR, there's VR, there's, a handful of other things you're talking about, maybe the idea of the apps that are like Echo and Amazon Alexa, where you're kind of having these voice-based applications where you're interacting with voice. I think we've yet to see the next platform that has been as successful as mobile. And I think that kind of lends itself, I would say, to that discussion, in my opinion. Of course, you can build theoretically, AR and VR with React Native. And I believe with React VR, you can actually already build some stuff like that with React Native. I have yet to look into it.
Artificial intelligence is dramatically evolving the way that our world works. And to make AI easier and faster, we need new kinds of hardware and software, which is why Intel acquired Nirvana Systems and its platform for deep learning. Intel Nirvana is hiring engineers to help develop a full stack for AI, from chip design to software frameworks. Go to softwareengineeringdaily.com/Intel to apply for an opening on the team. To learn more about the company, check out the interviews that I've conducted with its engineers. Those are also available at softwareengineeringdaily.com/Intel. Come build the future with Intel Nirvana. Go to softwareengineeringdaily.com/Intel to apply now. So when something like ARKit comes out, and I guess you and I are both sort of speaking offhand because we don't really know what it does or at what level of abstraction it works at, but I don't know, maybe you're able to speculate. Is this the kind of thing that React Native developers would build on top of? Like, would you build a React API on top of it to be able to work with the ARKit? Or is this the kind of thing where you would like sidestep React and write some native code that would interface with the ARKit because this is like an iOS specific thing? It might not necessarily be on Android. There might not be a similar thing on Android. Are there best practices for what the open source React Native community would do to be able to access this AR functionality in React Native?
Well, so far what we've seen is whenever there's a new platform that kind of comes out, someone kind of builds an abstraction to let us build on top of that new platform using React or React Native. For example, when the touch bar came out, within a couple of days or maybe a couple of weeks, there was a React Native touch bar. So you're able to basically use, the information and the knowledge that we already have to build React Native and start building touch bar apps. I believe for the most part, we're going to kind of see that continue if it's possible. So if someone can kind of build a React Native ARKit abstraction on top of ARKit and make it actually work in a decent way, I guess you would say, then that's kind of probably going to happen. Because really the core idea, at least when they announced React Native, was this idea of learn once and build anywhere, as opposed to what we were having, I guess, before React Native with some of these other hybrid technologies, was build once, run anywhere. So the idea of learn once and build anywhere basically lends itself to say, let's learn the core concepts behind React and React Native, and then we can kind of build across all these platforms without having to relearn a bunch of stuff. So if that continues to be, if it continues to kind of be the way we've been seeing it happen, then that's probably what's going to happen, if it's possible.
If I built something on top of ARKit, for example, or just some other software package, is there a performance penalty, or is there no performance penalty because it gets translated it from a React component into the native code at compile time?
I think you'll never be able to match native performance with any abstraction, because just the idea of an abstraction, we're kind of building on top of what we could just kind of be building in. So yeah, there's definitely going to be a little performance. That can be mitigated to almost nothing, I would say, if you kind of are really aware of what you're doing and you kind of know the best practices. But you'll never, in my opinion, get to the point where you're having the exact same native performance. It will be so minimal, though, maybe, that the user will never know the difference. But if you're kind of benchmarking things, then you will see, in my experience at least, a little performance hit. And you'll talk to people that kind of will say, that's not the case, and you'll see people that kind of maybe take that to an extreme and say it'll never be even close to native. But in reality, what I've seen so far has been people are building really high performant apps using React Native that kind of are undistinguishable really from native apps. But if you kind of benchmark these things using some of the benchmarking tools that we have, and you'll see that there is a slight performance hit.
Right. Like there are, so there's a certain app I use that I'm pretty sure is written in React Native. I don't want to name the name of it, but when it does some very simple, like just loading a simple list view, for example, there's some certain stutteriness that seems like if it were a purely native app, it would not experience. So I don't know if that's the React Native or if that's a poor implementation.
Yeah, a lot of times stuff like that is a poor implementation for something like that. Yeah.
Okay, then I shouldn't speak to that. Okay, but so let's say ARKit, it comes out and somebody does build the React AR layer on top of ARKit, and then Android comes out, and Android also has their Android AR thing, and it's slightly different. Like it has slightly different native APIs. And then the React Native community says, well, we want to build a set of APIs in React Native for interfacing with augmented reality, and maybe there's a disconnect between how Apple views AR and how Android views AR. How would the React Native community compromise in that case? And I realize this is very much a prognostication, but I'm just trying to get a handle of how you build a consistent layer on top of different inconsistent APIs.
Yeah, that's going to be super interesting to kind of watch. I mean, if you kind of really think about it, though, the inconsistencies between iOS and Android are pretty startling. If you actually learn iOS development and then you go learn Android development, the way they've kind of combined these APIs into a single consistent React Native API is pretty amazing. So I feel like there will never be a consistent, 100% consistent API, because there are going to be things, even with React Native, you have things like not touch bar, but you have things like tab bar iOS that are not on Android, and you have things that are just never going to be there, and you kind of have to code your way around those. So when you hear about code reuse being somewhere in the range of 75 to 95% for React Native cross-platform, that's where that 5 to 25% comes in, where we're kind of seeing those disagreements, I guess you would say, in implementations. But I've been pretty amazed so far, from what we've seen from React Native, as far as being able to build across all these platforms using that consistent single API. I feel like as long as it's kind of within the realm of being possible, then someone will kind of build it and make it available.
You run this training business, React Native. It's called React Native Training, right?
Yes.
Okay. And, I did a show a while ago about companies that use Ionic, and oftentimes these companies that use Ionic is a cross-platform way to build Angular. You write an Angular app, and it gives you a cross-platform app that works on Android and iOS. And the people I talked to about Ionic said that there's a lot of people a lot of large companies that will adopt this because, let's say they are some kind of warehousing company, or like John Deere Tractor. I don't know if John Deere Tractor was one of the actual examples, but I think of John Deere as this giant enterprise. It's not exactly a software company, but they've got all these technical problems. Like you've got a bunch of warehouse workers, and they're trying to like synchronize different things, and they're building tractors and whatnot. And everybody's got a mobile phone, and they've got some domain-specific apps on their mobile phone that help them manage the inventory in the warehouse. Maybe it helps them notice things around the factory. And at a giant company like John Deere, you might have a bunch of different domain-specific mobile apps. They're just internal mobile apps, and you don't need to really worry about the UX, for example. And so these are the kinds of companies that love Ionic, because you're just building these simple apps with simple list views that are just kind of doing CRUD stuff with a database somewhere, and the UI really doesn't matter. So when you're training these companies to learn to build React Native apps, how many of them are fall into that same category where it's like some big company and they they just want to build cross-platform apps. So whether, because they have all these employees and employees have iOS phones, they have Android phones. And so if you want to build internal apps for your entire employee base, you don't really want to worry about building separate Android and iOS apps. So are a large percentage of the companies that you're teaching React Native, are they these kinds of large enterprises?
I mean, it's hard to kind of put everyone into a single kind of niche or whatever, because really I've worked with literally the top, like 2 out of the top 5 technology companies in the world, all the way down to startups, all the way, and everything really in between. So for example, I just left Palo Alto last week, spent 3 days with this company. A few guys that had left Google have created this startup. They have good funding. They have an amazing back-end team with artificial intelligence engineers, and they've created these amazing APIs. So they have like 6 apps that are ready to go on the back end, but they're bottlenecked on the front end because they only have a handful of native developers, and they've spent a few months, and they've only kind of built maybe a single app and a single platform. So we come in there. We spent 3 days. We basically transformed many of their iOS and Android developers into React Native developers, and they also had a couple of web developers that kind of set in on the training as well. And now they're all able to contribute to build, React Native and cross-platform apps. And now with the cost of engineers being so expensive, especially out there in Silicon Valley and really in any big city, it's not only expensive, but it's hard to find good ones. So when you do find a good developer, you want to kind of maximize their efficiency. So basically what React Native is allowing these companies to do is take their existing knowledge and kind of sharpen it and accelerate it and kind of start building with React Native using a lot of their existing knowledge along with this new React Native. And they're building the exact same applications they were building before. The UI is amazing. We're not just building list views. We're building really nice user experiences with animations and everything that you would kind of want from a enterprise app or like a really, a high quality app. One of those apps where you kind of are playing with it and you're using it and it just feels really good. That's kind of the target for React Native. And I think that's kind of why React Native is done a little better than Cordova. And I feel like Ionic is amazing, and it's, it's a really great framework, and I used it quite a bit before I kind of got into React Native, but I feel like React Native is maybe one step or a few steps ahead of Ionic, just because with Ionic you are kind of limited to web technologies. You have to worry about browser issues and things like that. You're working with the DOM. With React Native, you're actually working with real native components. And the enterprise companies I've worked with, these companies, I'm just kind of blown away when I hear the projects that they're working on. They're literally taking billion-dollar applications that are already generating revenue, and they're transforming these into React Native. They're taking new projects and they're building these using React Native. They're not building these using iOS or Android developers or using native iOS and Android platforms. They're building these. And a company that I've done quite a bit of consulting with, that is one of these top 5 tech companies, is building all of their new native apps using React Native. And and they're not affiliated with Facebook in any way. So it's kind of been very interesting. It's very promising, at least for my company, because we are in that, we're in that space and we're kind of doing that type of training. And it's very interesting to kind of see this kind of uptick in interest and adoption.
So when you're training these companies to use React Native, you tend to start with the fundamentals. What are the fundamentals of React Native?
The fundamentals of React Native are really the fundamentals of JavaScript. So, we kind of start off by walking through a generated React Native project, just kind of going through the folder structure and kind of looking at the code. And then we literally jump into a couple of hours of JavaScript. We're doing a combination of JavaScript basics, but we're also doing ES6 and ES 2015 fundamentals. So we're kind of reviewing not only basic JavaScript stuff, but we're using this new syntax that you're going to be seeing in all of the documentation, all of the open source projects, all of the Stack Overflow answers. We're kind of explaining what this new ES6 syntax is. So that's kind of the fundamentals of React Native are really a combination of JavaScript and React. So because React Native is built on top of React, you still have these existing things that are React specific, like lifecycle methods, like component creation, like data management, props, and state. So we kind of do an entire day almost of going over all of the fundamentals of React and JavaScript. So once you kind of understand all of that, you're able to get up and running pretty quickly. And I think the reason that we've had such demand really is because a lot of these developers are used to coming from ecosystems like Java and iOS that are a little more consistent and they're a little more cohesive. Whereas JavaScript and the web technologies in general are kind of like the wild, wild west. So you go online to find some answers, some documentation, you'll find 15 different answers, and it's kind of hard to kind of pinpoint, what is the best practice without wasting a lot of time. So we kind of distill all of these best practices, all of these things into a single 2 or 3 day, boot camp type of training, and kind of get everyone, laser focused on what exactly you need to know and kind of the most up-to-date practices and the most up-to-date libraries and all of that stuff.
In React, you are building apps out of components. Give an overview of the React component lifecycle, because I know this is something that you tackle in your training operations.
Yeah, so there's kind of two different ways to create a React component. One of them is a stateful component, and you normally do that using a class, a JavaScript class, and then there's a stateless component. A stateless component is basically creating a React component or a piece of UI and functionality just using a JavaScript function. But as far as the lifecycle methods are concerned, you basically are using a React class, using a JavaScript class really, and you kind of hook into these components. When you create a new component, you kind of have all of these lifecycle methods that are triggered, and you can kind of hook into them if you would like. So there's things like component will mount, component did mount, you have render, and you're kind of able to hook into APIs, and you're able to do different things within that lifecycle. So we kind of will dive into exactly how all these work and kind of when you should use each of these and when you should not use each of these, I guess you would say.
I did a show with Tadeo Zagallo, who works on the React Native team, and he described this bridge between native code and JavaScript. This is essentially what facilitates the JavaScript that you write for React Native, how that gets translated into native code or how it communicates with native code. Describe how that bridge works.
Yeah, so basically we're able to kind of go into, say, if we want to build something and expose an API from iOS, we'll create a header and an M file, and we'll write our functionality, and we'll basically export that using a method called RCT, I believe, export. And then you're able to just require whatever functionality or whatever UI you need from within your JavaScript class or your JavaScript file. You will call RCT export. You'll pass in whatever that you've created, and then you're basically able to just import it from your JavaScript just like you would a normal JavaScript file. So it's pretty interesting, and it's pretty simple to use once you kind of understand it. But I believe that's kind of really what I've seen so far, at least, the bottleneck for web developers and JavaScript developers, where as opposed to an iOS or an Android developer, they kind of shine when it's time to kind of start digging into the more complex stuff, which is bridging. Because for us web developers, because that's what I am, I'm traditionally a web developer that kind of am getting into React Native as opposed to a native developer getting into React Native. Understanding that native side is very, very valuable. So you're able to kind of quickly implement things as a native developer that a web developer or a JavaScript developer probably would take years to learn, because you already kind of understand the underlying building blocks and things like that. But in general, the best practices, and based on the people that kind of create and maintain React Native, the whole idea really is to kind of stick to JavaScript as much as possible and kind of not go into the native side unless you absolutely have to. So that's just kind of something to keep in mind if you're listening and you're kind of wanting to learn more about it. But it is very simple to kind of hook into the native side.
You write that lists are very important in React Native, and list views are fundamental to apps, but they seem like such a simple subject to me. What is so complicated about lists that you have to spend a lot of time on the subject of lists in your training sessions?
Well, the basic idea of a list is very simple. You just have an array of items and you kind of just spit those out into your UI. But when you're actually dealing in a real business case scenario, there's a lot of other things that are kind of involved. First of all, say you have an infinite list, like how many items do you want to show per page and what performance benefits are you going to get if you kind of understand, how many items you should show versus, what performance hit you're going to take if you kind of just spit out a million items, and how do you handle that? Also, there's things like you're going to have interactions with these lists. Maybe you want to have an on-press method, or maybe you want to have different things that are rendered based on whatever is kind of in that data set. I wouldn't say it's kind of a hard thing to understand. It's more of like it's one of those things where like there's an 80-20 rule. If you kind of fundamentally really grok and kind of can build and use lists very quickly and efficiently, if we kind of spend a lot of time going over all the different ways there are to do that and how to handle all these issues, you can kind of get up and running quickly in a real world scenario and be very productive.
Spring is a season of growth and change. Have you been thinking you'd be happier at a new job? If you're dreaming about a new job and have been waiting for the right time to make a move, go to hired.com/sedaily today. Hired makes finding work enjoyable. Hired uses an algorithmic job matching tool in combination with a talent advocate who will walk you through the process of finding a better job. Maybe you want more flexible hours, or more money, or remote work. Maybe you want to work at Zillow, or Squarespace, or Postmates, or some of the other top technology companies that are desperately looking for engineers on Hired. You and your skills are in high demand. You listen to a software engineering podcast in your spare time, so you're clearly passionate about technology. Check out hired.com/sedaily to get a special offer for Software Engineering Daily listeners. A $600 signing bonus from Hired when you find that great job that gives you the respect and the salary that you deserve as a talented engineer. I love Hired because it puts you in charge. Go to hired.com/sedaily, and thanks to Hired for being a continued long-running sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. Yeah. So the difference between React Native and Kubernetes are the two open source projects that I probably spend the most time discussing these days because they have so much momentum behind them. And React Native is basically on the front end and Kubernetes is on the back end. And Kubernetes I see a little more of a direct route to monetization for companies that are working on open source around it because it's like a platform and you can build higher level stuff on it. You can build higher level offerings that you can basically charge for in arbitrage, cloud storage, or cloud, networking, like different things where you can charge people based on the amount of resources that they consume. And that's a really good business because you get margin off of those resources that you're consuming. But with React Native, it's a little bit different because you're not really, whatever you're building, you're not really turning it into a SaaS product unless you're maybe Expo. I mean, Expo is kind of you could see that morphing into a SaaS product. And so that kind of makes sense to me that the angle that these companies are taking where, how are we going to monetize our expertise in React Native without building React Native apps ourselves? Well, we do training, we do educational resources, we do outreach, we write open source software as a way of getting leads and then talk to people. That makes a lot of sense to me. It's too bad that, I think part of the reason why Kubernetes is moving much faster. Well, I don't know if it's moving faster than React Native, but I think the amount of attention that Kubernetes has is significantly higher than React Native because there is a bigger monetization opportunity there. And if there were some bigger monetization opportunity, then perhaps there would be more of a direct route to making money off of it. I think you see these sort of consulting style routes or training style routes basically because of the monetization hurdles for people who are experts. I mean, does that resonate with you, what I just said?
Yeah, totally. And the scalability of something like Kubernetes or whatever, I'm not sure if I said that right, is on a different, in a different ballpark really than something like React Native, just because you're looking at the basic business fundamentals of something like that, how that could happen. And like when you talk about, monetization, it really kind of depends on, what the focus of the company is. So like if you want to be $1 billion company, it may be tough to kind of build something, just I would say in the sense of what we're kind of doing with React Native training as far as an open source project and make that $1 billion product. But if you are just kind of looking to kind of make a living and do what you love to do and kind of help the community, I believe that, or even build an agency, which could, possibly make a lot of money. I believe this whole idea of building like an open source repository and building a lot of open source stuff and giving it away and using that as a way to market yourself, market your expertise, market you as a leader in that space, similar to how Infinite Red and Formidable Labs are both kind of doing in the React and JavaScript space, React Native space. So Formidable Labs has just an array of really great open source projects that they've kind of created and put out there. They have a few different ones. I believe one of them you can make slides with. I'm completely forgetting the names of all of the stuff that they've done. So they have like this, I think it's Spectacle, where you can create slides using JavaScript. It's really nice. But anyway, so like you look up a few different consulting companies, for example, you want to build an app. You run across Formidable, and then you run across a few other ones. And you see Formidable has like all of these, repos, and they've done all of this awesome stuff, and you can kind of see their code, and they are like obviously leaders in, in a certain space. You're probably going to go with them, and it makes a lot of sense. And then you have companies like React Training with Michael Jackson and Ryan Florence, and us, React Native Training, and a few other companies that are kind of doing a similar thing in the open source space with training and consulting. So for us, I feel like it's a good way for us to kind of, instead of getting paid directly to build things like React Native Elements, which we have as a UI library for React Native, or create XP app, or any of the other repos that we have that kind of benefit React Native developers, instead of getting paid directly to do that stuff, we kind of branch off and do these consulting and these training things, and we kind of stick everything in one single repo. So when people do kind of go out and try to find someone like us, they can find us and kind of see what we're doing. And it's been a really nice way to kind of get a pipeline of leads. We're not trying to make $1 billion, and I don't think a lot of these other companies are either. So it kind of makes sense in our space. But if you're trying to get venture capital and kind of do something, you're going to have to probably take a different approach.
Yeah, I mean, content marketing as a way to build a personal brand or to build a technical brand, great strategy. That's why, that's kind of what I have been doing with Software Engineering Daily. I knew I wanted to start a software company, and the road to doing that was unclear, and so I kind of started an intermediate, which was Software Engineering Daily, which is not a venture-backable business. It's not exactly a scalable business. It doesn't have the same scalable properties as a SaaS product or some mobile app that I can just sell for $1. But in some ways, the non-defensible business model where you're doing something that's kind of commoditized, like training or consulting or making content, in some ways that's an easier business to get started with and to get profitable with, because despite the fact that it's commoditized, but there's so much demand for it that it's a really good business to just stand up and get going. And then you get yourself embedded in the community, and there's all kinds of rocket ships that are being built in the community. So I think I don't really know where we were going with this topic, but if there are people who are looking for a business to start, you could do worse than starting with some sort of either education or content or consulting business that doesn't seem scalable, but it can get you in a position to where you're the master of your own destiny and you've got a positive cash flow business.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And it's kind of like starting slowly and kind of getting yourself rooted in the community, like you said. And also like with something like your podcast, you've met everyone that kind of is active in all these different spaces. So now, like, if you get an interest in something, you have connections, you can kind of maybe reach out to these people and ask them questions, but you also have a very large breadth of knowledge about what's going on. And if you listen to this podcast, you'll have a similar breadth of knowledge, about what's going on in general. But kind of just knowing all this stuff, it makes you kind of aware of what's going on. So if you do have an idea, you kind of can kind of pursue that idea much easier than if you kind of were not really aware of what's going on.
Yeah. So are you involved in the React Native open source community? Do you contribute code to React Native open source, or do you just write mostly?
So my partner is Mike Grabowski, and he's more of a contributor to React Native, the actual project. I've contributed a very small handful of times. Mike is actually in charge of releasing React Native to the community. So every time there's a new release, he actually is the one that releases that for Facebook. He actually does he helps him and his company, CallStack, which is his other company. They do all of the release notes. And CallStack is also another agency that does React Native and React consulting, by the way. They're similar to kind of Infinite Red and Formidable. They're in Poland. They do a lot of work all across the world, though. They're very specialized in React and React Native. But so he's contributed quite a bit to React Native, but also React Navigation, which is the navigation library. I've contributed more I'm part of the React Native community open source repo. I'm also part of of course, React Native training repo. We have a lot of stuff there. I've also helped with Reason React app, which is kind of like a way to build React apps using the Reason language, I guess you would say. But yeah, it's kind of just whatever I feel like I'm able to contribute to, I will contribute to it. And it's kind of different at a given point in time.
So, I had one specific question around building apps, or just a certain situation that a startup might be in. So let's say a startup hires you to do training for their company because they have an iOS app that they want to get into Android. And the roadmap that they're suggesting to you is, we're going to migrate our iOS app to React Native as much as possible as we build our Android apps, so that we can do a lot of code sharing among, in that process. Is that a typical strategy that companies take? Is that a good idea where, because I know it's commonly accepted wisdom that if you're building a mobile app, you start with iOS because that's where a lot of the early adopters are. And then if you want to get it to Android, maybe today the best practice might be kind of do this simultaneous rewrite of React Native in the iOS app while you're also building your Android app, so that you can do some code sharing. I mean, is that like boiling the ocean, or is that actually a good idea?
So you're saying basically, like, you have an iOS app, it's working great, you have users, and now you want to build Android. So you're saying the best practice now might be to kind of start building Android and porting over like the iOS stuff. And you're asking maybe what that would look like in a React Native world?
Yeah, I guess, I should have phrased this better. I should have phrased it in a more open-ended sense, but more like, if I've got an iOS app and I want to get my Android app going, and I also want to get on board with React Native at the same time, is that too much to ask? Is there a better route to doing that? What's the best route to getting to the glorious place where I can do code sharing and reuse between my React Native app and my iOS app? Sorry, my iOS app and my Android app.
Yeah, right now, the way I would kind of tell a company to do that, and it would be, in my opinion, the best way, if it made sense based on their existing app, if it was something that was right for React Native, would be basically to kind of start rewriting cross-platform in React Native. So instead of just building for Android, just go ahead and build for both Android and iOS, because you're going to be almost as efficient, if not a little more efficient, building, with React Native anyway. So kind of go ahead and port over everything into React Native, both iOS and Android, and go ahead and kind of rebuild that using React Native, and then you're able to kind of launch again using, both platforms. That would be kind of the way I would say to do something like that.
Are there a lot of companies that come to you and they're in a situation where they've got either an iOS app or an Android app, and they're trying to figure out the best route to getting to both of those being managed with React Native?
If it's not an enterprise company, that's almost always the case, actually. So a lot of the companies I work with that are not enterprise are kind of in that scenario. But instead of asking me if React Native is kind of the right choice, they've kind of already done the research, and they've come to the conclusion that this is probably the right technology for them. And we'll usually consult with them before we go in there to just make sure 100% that this is going to make sense for them. If they have and when it wouldn't make sense, I guess would be a good thing to talk about. So if, like I said, games and stuff like that would be not a good use of the technology. But say you have a handful of like really talented Android and iOS engineers, and maybe there's politics involved where they do not want to kind of learn React Native, and it's going to kind of throw a wrench into your to your basic culture or whatever you have going on in your company, that might not make a lot of sense. So if you already have really talented developers and you're kind of iterating quickly and there just might not, and you're okay with your payroll, it might not make sense to kind of start, working on learning something completely new. I would say in general, that kind of would be the scenario I would kind of throw out there.
Do you spend a lot of time training the other Facebook technology, the open Facebook technologies like GraphQL?
No, I'm very specialized. So I'm very specialized right now with React and React Native. I understand GraphQL. I've used it quite a bit, but it's kind of not something that I teach. I feel like the more, at least in my experience, the more specialized you are, the better you can kind of be at that one thing and just do it really well and kind of, just know everything there is to know about that one thing. And I'm super interested in kind of expanding my breadth of knowledge, honestly. I feel like the more that I learn about React Native, the more there is to learn, and the more I go meet with companies, the more questions that are asked that I don't have the answers to. I have to go back and learn and find those answers. And then I feel like, there's just always this rabbit hole of things that you want to learn. And just based on my experience, the more specialized I've become, the better business has been. So I feel like as GraphQL becomes more intertwined with React Native in the ecosystem, it will be something I need to kind of learn better and be able to teach. But right now, we teach pretty much strictly JavaScript and React Native. We don't even really go into any React stuff other than kind of teaching React and to onboard people. We don't really take React web clients. So,
to conclude, I've asked some people who are deeply embedded in the React ecosystem. I always like to ask them, under what circumstances would it make sense for Facebook to build an operating system? And I know this is totally speculative questioning, but I find it interesting because you see Facebook building all these interesting tools, and you see React Native as this unifying force for mobile development. Can you see a world in which it would make sense for Facebook to build a mobile operating system, or do you think this would maybe make more sense once we get to the AR world with the AR glasses?
So the closest thing that I would say to keep an eye on regarding this question, because it's super interesting and I've thought quite a bit about it myself, is kind of what Expo is doing. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Expo became kind of that new distribution platform for apps. The problem right now we're seeing, of course, everybody kind of understands the issues with submitting two separate platforms to the Play Store and the App Store and how that whole process goes and how it's kind of difficult for, I would say, new developers that don't really understand how to do that to get going with it. But then if you have an update on the native side, it's kind of a process. And then with web, you're limited to kind of the DOM and these smaller bundle sizes, and it's great, and it's become way better than it used to be, but there's still limitations there. I think what Expo seems to be doing is kind of creating that new platform and that new distribution system. And I would not be surprised if it not Expo, something like Expo would be that next thing. Because with Expo, you can kind of create and distribute very easily and seamlessly and kind of share things. And it's a lot more open and a lot less friction. And it's very, very nice to work with. I think something like Expo, I would not be surprised if a company like Facebook acquired Expo and kind of did what you just said. And if it's not Expo, I believe it'll be something that is along the same lines of Expo, where they have innovated in this new way. And that's kind of something I would keep an eye on.
Yeah, but it sounds like you think something like this is going to happen, whether it's in this current world that we're living in, or we have to wait till there's a big platform shift to glasses or something.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I'm super interested in AR and VR, and I love the idea of glasses and even the idea of contact lenses, even that kind of portray this virtual world on top of our existing world, and it's awesome. But I think phones are just so intertwined in our lives, and they're just very easily used and useful. You stick them in your pocket, you pull it out, you're kind of used to doing it. I feel like there will have to be a 10x increase in productivity and just ease of use and just user experience for us to kind of move to that next platform. And I do believe that will happen. I just don't know what it is, and I don't think it's anything we've seen yet. I think it's going to be kind of a new thing that we don't even know about. Mm-hmm. And for that to happen, I believe it's going to be a few years longer than what a lot of people are expecting. But when it does come, it's going to completely rewrite how we think about apps in general, really.
Yeah, can you imagine all of the work that has basically been wasted over the years because people have had to write their apps in two places? And we just take that for granted today. Like, that's just the way that it has to be done. But I really hope that the next platform, whatever the hell it is, does not have the same rewrite problem.
I agree. I think we're going to look back on these days and we're going to just wonder like what the hell we were thinking. We're limited with what we have, and it's getting better. There will be something that comes along and replaces React Native. There will be something that comes along and replaces, the phone as a platform. I'm just very, very interested to see what that is, and I'm excited about that happening, honestly.
Yeah. All right, Nader. Well, thanks for coming on the show. Everybody who's listening who is interested in React Native, check out React Native Radio. It's a podcast that Nader hosts. Really interesting, a lot of topics around React Native. So thanks for coming on the show, Nader.
Thanks for having me on, Jeff. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Simplify continuous delivery with GoCD, the on-premise, open-source, continuous delivery tool by ThoughtWorks. With GoCD, you can easily model complex deployment workflows using pipelines, and you can visualize them end-to-end with its value stream map. You get complete visibility into and control of your company's deployments. At gocd.io/sedaily, you can find out how to bring continuous delivery to your teams. Say goodbye to deployment panic and hello to consistent, predictable deliveries. Visit gocd.io/sedaily to learn more about GoCD. Commercial support and enterprise add-ons, including disaster recovery, are available. Thank you to GoCD, and thank you to ThoughtWorks. I'm a huge fan of ThoughtWorks and their products, including GoCD, and we're fans of continuous delivery. So check out gocd.io/sedaily.
Wow!